When Putin's military aggression came knocking down at the gates of Ukraine, many wars and media analysts seemed divided, torn between the question of an impending World War III or Russia's rise as the victor in Ukraine. We all have seen how the situation has unfolded. After some shocking turn of events, it seems like Putin's hold onto its neighbor is a long thought-out losing strategy. And as usual, the United States has everything to do about it. Why, you ask? Well, in this world, cash is king. In this video, we're breaking down everything about the US's continued financial support to Ukraine, and if it signals the loss in Russia's prowess. Let's get digging. Why is Russia losing in Ukraine? Folks, when there has been any comparison between the military might of the Cold War powers, the deciding line has always been the money. Sure, the question of NATO's collaboration and Putin's lonely social life is always going to be haunting. But the way these military powers spend on the budget is pretty fascinating. Now, you'd imagine that, hey, the way Putin is in and about invading lands from Ukraine to Crimea, the Kremlin must be loaded. Come on. When aren't they sourcing military-grade weaponry or ammunition? Here's the thing though, Moscow always had its way with numbers. What it really can't beat is how much the US chooses to spend on humanitarian or armed financial aid. And let's just say that Russia got its lesson 101 not too long ago. So here's the bigger question getting answered. As compared to Russia's $61.7 billion expenditure on the military, the US spends $738 billion. And that's just 3.42% of its GDP. While on the other side, Moscow allocates almost 4.3% of its GDP on protecting the borders or invading its neighbors, whatever suits its fancy. All of these are economic-centric numbers, and the math behind them is jarring. Plus, accurate military transactions are never transparent for security reasons. Yet these numbers tell a story of why Russia is losing desperately in Ukraine. When the Russian leader supreme started his campaign in Kiev, his forces worked through any calls for ceasefires and a series of Western sanctions. For the most part, the Russian armed forces seemed unstoppable as a flood of Ukraine refugees seeped into different parts of Europe. Yet, in a few weeks, Moscow considered striking negotiations for a peace agreement or a neutrality agreement with Zelensky. Alright, the efforts went down the drain, but the far more important question is, what changed for Putin? He had promised to continue his aggression until his noble dream of one Russia seemed like a reality. What's up with Russia's defense budget? One reason why Russian forces backed off was the unprecedented Ukraine defense. But hey, that didn't happen overnight. Ever since 2014, the US has allocated over $20.3 billion to Ukraine in humanitarian and military assistance. The number sounds super mellow until you get to know that since 2021 only, the allocated amount tallies up to $18.2 billion in security assistance. Yep, this is Russia's worst nightmare. Now, when Putin is desperately organizing mass mobilization in his country to recover the lost Ukrainian territory, Biden has hit him right where it hurts the most. That's Moscow's almost broken supply chain system of money. The thing is, Ukraine's counteroffense has been remarkably strong. Badass even. United States security funding has a lot to do with this. As unbelievable as it is, the mass media is filled with images and videos of Russian soldiers fleeing the Ukrainian grounds. You can see them leaving their weapons behind as they take refuge in their tanks or helicopters. It wasn't surprising to see that Putin's minions had to face a humiliating defeat in Izium and Kupiansk. The soldiers also had to retreat from the prized Oskil and Seversky Donets rivers. Surprise, surprise, Ukrainian soldiers were quick to reclaim their rightful territory. These are just a few examples of how terrible and immature the Russian defense is going on in Ukraine. Putin's call for partial military mobilization just shows how weak his forces are faring. Not to mention, this move was super unpopular with his inner circle, which seems to get tired of the series of unfortunate events at the hands of Zelensky. To cut things short, things are more or less terrible for Russia, and the lack of money in its center is just another bad news of the day. The story of Kerch Bridge. So, within this turmoil, Russia isn't really into stopping its aggression. Their strategy always has been to attack the most urban centers for maximum damage. Yep, there's no regard for war crimes whatsoever. It seemed like Putin had chosen to retaliate against his enemies when he rained airstrikes on the major Ukrainian cities. This series of attacks is being condemned as the most fatal and dangerous stunt that Russia has pulled on Ukraine since the start of the war. One by one, the Russian forces targeted all major cities, including Kiev, Lviv, Ternopil, and Zhytomyr. Putin was pissed off that the Ukrainian forces have bombed the important bridge that links Ukraine with the Russian-annexed Crimea, known as Kerch. He dubbed the attack as an act of terrorism so appropriately, he responded with more terrorism. Make it make sense. So far, it is unclear who knocked down the bridge, but one thing is as clear as daylight. Putin's little maneuver might cost him his campaign in Ukraine, because lo and behold, as soon as the news of airstrikes reached the Pentagon, Biden's administration signed an additional $725 million in security aid for Zelensky. Pretty sure Putin did not see that one coming. Who knew that it would only take a strategic attack on Ukraine's power grid for the US to pull out another hefty check for the affected country? In a statement, the Pentagon said, "The United States has delivered unprecedented security assistance to Ukraine and will continue to work with allies and partners to ensure Ukraine has the support it needs." Sure, Russia might even muster up the guts or some low-tier trade agreements to match America's continued support, but it's the weaponry security support that can take the Federation's forces out, quite literally and metaphorically. What does the new aid package look like? Other than the $725 million check, Ukraine will also be receiving an ammunition package that includes high-mobility artillery rocket systems, 5,000 anti-tank weapons, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, small arms ammunition, and so on. As usual, the US will also be providing the country with medical supplies, citing the loss of human life during the airstrike. It seems like the US was already in the process of dispatching another wave of supplies to their NATO ally when the proceedings on the Kerch Bridge made them accelerate the process. Is this the final nail in Russia's coffin? Now, here's the thing. Newly equipped Ukraine has more ground to cover. With their high morale and strategic counterattack moves, Russian forces seem highly unskilled. So the news of America's security aid is going to put a psychological toll on Putin's army. Not to mention, they were promised a few weeks of fighting before they could potentially celebrate a victory. But that didn't happen, did it? After the news of military mobilization got out, many potential Russian draftees started to flee the country. Their only incentive to fight Putin's war is money. And yes, the army is offering some very lucrative salaries to the draftees, but as the numbers pile up and sanctions grow in number, money is thin. And as we reminded you all at the start of this video, in war making, cash is king. And that's just not it. Some pretty credible news outlets are reporting that the Federal Security Service of Russia, which works like the CIA, is not happy with its leader. The intelligence office has always won its battle with manipulation, blackmail, and short yet ruthless attacks. Their biggest exhibit A is their decisive victory in Crimea. So, when the campaign boils down to utilizing all of the manpower in Kiev, FSB is truly not vibing with their leader supreme. If anything, the $750 million aid by the US could be the final nail in the coffin. Don't worry, you will once again find Putin making the same old-school argument about redirecting his gas exports to Asia instead of Europe. But the claims of a solid economy are running their course. On the outlook, Russia is still putting a chunk of its GDP into fighting a lost cause in Ukraine. But by the looks of it, for every dollar that Putin can pull out, Biden has 10 to bank on. So far, so good. That's it for today's video, folks. Do you think Russia's end in Ukraine is near? Let us know in the comments below. See you soon.